I'm Matt Price from SBS Online. I just had a question about how the passport deals with fluctuations in a rider's hematocrit basis on their competition schedule. So, for example, I understand that if over the course of a 3-week tour, for example, a rider who's not doping the hematocrit should start at a certain level and gradually decline over the course of the 3 weeks. Does the passport and its red lines, so the threshold limits, does that take into account that a rider has been competing non-stop for 2.5 weeks? So therefore, if there is a spike, no matter how small, or at a rest day or on the stage before the big mountains, for example, does the bio passport register that as an anomaly, even though the rider's hematocrit level could still be within their sort of resting natural state, if that makes sense?
Yeah. You see it all the time, that at the beginning of a tour, within 4 or 5 days, the hemoglobin could be varies 5–10% lower than the beginning, and then it stays that way. And it's just as suspicious to see a blood profile that doesn't change during a major tour as it is to see a blood value go up outside of a competition. Does the AVP software take that into account? Yes. There's another column that's in competition or out of competition. In competition, you know the sample was collected during an event like that, and you make that allowance rather than the software adjusting for the limit.
G'day. Just a quick technical question, Mike, and thanks for answering so many questions about this. I was just wondering if the sensitivity coefficient of variation on the hematological assays is interacting with the 1 in 1,000 probability that the system looks for. I imagine that the error associated with the assays is wider than the actual 1 in 1,000 probability of data.
The way that's brought into the consideration is that we measure the athletes on the instruments, and so when, say, your true value doesn't change, say hemoglobin 150, 150, 150, the measurements that we get might be 150, 151, 149. So the variation that was due to the instrument is built into the variations that we allow. And so when you test the athlete on the instrument, that variation that you're going to see in their values is already allowed for because we saw that beforehand and built it into the tolerances. So if there was no analytical variation, the tolerances would be much smaller than what they are.
And that also applies if you've got a value that's right on that limit, right on that threshold, where there's variation that's due to the analysis.
You don't have to allow for it twice. You've allowed for it once, and if the value is a blip over that red line, you don't say, well, now let's allow for that analytical error. It's already accounted for. Is that your point? That if it's close, do you then make an allowance for the analytical error?
Yeah.
No, it's done once. You only have to do it once.
Okay. Just one brief one, and it's a yes/no answer. Given the relationship between sample size and the error of the instrument, is there a minimum number of samples that you take from an athlete before you say, okay, we've characterised the ranges for all of the measures you use?
No, you can do it from the first sample. It's very unlikely that you would ever take any action on one result, but you could from the first sample.
I'd just like to say, I think the biological passport definitely is a fantastic tool to, as you said, to identify suspects. But in any case, I think that, as a scientist, from a scientific point of view, is enough to determine what actually happened. Now, my point here is, and I think the problem, and some other people have raised here, is like you at the end, you're demonstrating that there is something that's out of the normal pattern, but you really haven't identified what the thing is, and it's what Martin has said at the beginning. And to me, it's absolutely impossible to athlete or anybody else to try to dispute the scientific evidence when they are not scientists themselves. So my question here, or my comment would be, definitely when you do your recommendation, still, I think it should be proven what caused fail the test. I mean, you have to prove that there is EPO there. Maybe I don't know the exact science about the biological passport, so I really don't know whether the concomitant increase in reticulocytes and hemoglobin is a certainty that could be caused by EPO. But my understanding is there are other causes that could, other reasons that could also cause that. People have mentioned altitude and other things. So from, I guess, the legal aspect, which I totally ignorant, it would be very difficult to rule against somebody being doping with actually you pointing out precisely what is the cause of failing the test. I mean, most of you already have answered the question. I mean, that's my point of view.
Firstly, we don't have to prove it. We have to convince the court to come to satisfaction.
But they're ruling according to recommendation is how certain you are that the probable cause is that the...
Yeah, no, I wasn't trying to avoid the question.
Yeah.
Well, the scenario that we've got is that, and I mean, this is because Floyd Landis has had the courage to come out and tell us what he was doing. I now know that athletes use transfusion and EPO simultaneously. Now, the WADA prohibited list has transfusion and EPO listed separately. Now, is Floyd Landis using transfusion, or is he using EPO, or is he using both simultaneously? Now, you can come up with just about any permutation with both of those that could give you just about any blood result. So, if I'm asked what is my opinion that could have caused that result, I'll say, well, it's quite likely that that result would come if the athlete had used EPO transfusion. I can give that sort of opinion, but I can never say that caused it, nothing else, because I know lots of different things could have contributed.
Yeah, and I totally agree with you. So it's very difficult to, you can always have a very nice hypothesis fitting all the data, but to actually prove that hypothesis is very difficult. Now, what to me, for what you guys have been telling about the procedure is to decide whether to have an action in that particular case or no, is that you have to ask the athlete what to prove have an explanation for that result when I don't think that it's absolutely possible for them to get to that conclusion. I think it should be up to the scientists saying, okay, or the experts say, okay, yeah, there is this possibility, but sorry, what I should say is, you mentioned that you do the recommendation, it goes to ECI, and then it goes back to the 9 experts in the panel. So what happens there is, if you think there's an unanimous decision that there is something weird going on, do you guys, the next action is actually do more analysis in existing samples to try to identify presence of recombinant EPO or something else, or what's the procedure after that point you mentioned?
Yeah, sometimes that will happen, and we would sometimes recommend we'll go and have a look at those urine samples during that phase, see if there was anything. It's this difficult sort of scenario that when we're sitting in a room as experts, as far as I understand, we're allowed to have an opinion.
The law requires you to have one.
Right. Now, once I have to go and give a statement to a hearing, I can't have an opinion. And so it's this difficult, I sit here, I satisfy myself this right is dope, and then when it comes to writing a statement, I can't give an opinion. And that's something that I find particularly challenging at the moment, but like I said, liberating in as much as, okay, I'll answer that question, I'll answer that question. And so it would be, say, extremely likely to get that blood result if you use transfusion and EPO. It would be highly unlikely to get that blood result if you hadn't dope. Then the court needs to make an opinion, well, did he dope or not?
Thank you. We treat that as an opinion.
Yeah, thank you. I think time is up. Thank you for many good questions. Thank you to the panel for having enlightened us. I think we should conclude this by giving them a hand for their effort.